Welcome, listeners, to Snippit Sports Science Podcast. This is Jared Coleman-Starr, today with Chris Gavilio. How are you doing today, Chris?
Yeah, very well, Jared. How are you, mate?
Very good, thank you. Today we're looking at the article, and this is one of my favorite articles, probably one of my most referred articles across the board. One of the things that I email out to people pretty regularly is the BASES, Expert Statement on Exercise, Immunity, and Infection.
Why is this your most referred to article?
Oh, it's so straightforward and perfect. And I think it answers one of those most common questions that people have of, what do I do when I get sick? You know, do I stop exercising? Do I keep exercising? What's best for illness? You know, it obviously would depend on how severely ill you are, but we know that exercise can be both good for illness and bad for illness. It's confusing.
It's a really good article, isn't it? Like, when you sent it to me, it's an expert statement. It's quite punchy and to the point. So I reckon we just get straight into it.
Right. And well, I do just want to add in, I think BASES is, as you say, this is such a great article. I think BASES is one of those groups that is one of the best sports science groups out there. You know, they remind me a lot of Sprint NZ, Aspire from Aspetar, Qatar. So this article is by Michael Gleason and Neil P. Walsh. And both of those guys are two of the highest experts in exercise immunology, particularly. And, you know, if you want to find a smart person, one of those smart people will be an immunologist, and another one of those smart persons will be an exercise physiologist. You put the two together and you got a couple of geniuses here. And again, from Loughborough University. Funny how often we come up with those. So just a quick overview of this article. We note that an individual's level of physical activity influences their risk of infection, most likely by affecting immune function. Regular, moderate exercise reduces the risk of infection compared with a sedentary lifestyle, but very prolonged bouts of exercise and periods of intensified training, such as what we do with the elite athletes, are associated with an increased risk of infection. There are several lifestyle, nutritional, and training strategies that can be adopted to limit the extent of exercise-induced immunodepression and minimize the risk of infection. This is an expert statement that provides a background summarizing the evidence, together with extensive conclusions and practical guidelines.
Moving straight on, the relationship between habitual physical activity levels and immune function affects us all because everyone gets infections, and the amount of exercise people undertake affects their susceptibility to infection. As Jared said previously, acute bouts of exercise causes a temporary depression of various aspects of immune function that will usually last for 3 to 24 hours after exercise, depending on the intensity and duration of the exercise bout. Several studies indicate that the incidence of symptoms of upper respiratory tract illness, or URTIs, as it's sometimes known as, is increased in the days after prolonged strenuous endurance events, and it has been generally assumed that this reflects the temporary depression of immune function induced by prolonged exercise. More recently, it's been proposed that at least some of the symptoms of an URTI in exercises are attributed to upper respiratory airway inflammation rather to infectious episodes. And this is perhaps what we all think: we get sick, we get infected, as opposed to, this is quite a good point about upper airway inflammation. Periods of intensified training have been shown to depress immune function, and although elite athletes are not clinically immune deficient, it is possible that the combined effects of small changes in several immune factors may compromise resistance to common illnesses, particularly during periods of prolonged heavy training and at times of major competition. There appears to be no influence of the sex of an athlete on susceptibility of upper respiratory tract infections, but some athletes are more prone to illnesses than others. This is a major concern for athletes and as also coaches who we coach athletes, as even minor infections can impair exercise performance or even prevent the athlete from competing. In contrast, moderate levels of regular exercise are thought to confer decreased susceptibility to illness compared with a sedentary lifestyle. This has relevance for the general population and in particular elderly people.
Moving into the background and evidence, we see that the most common infections in otherwise healthy people are those of the respiratory tract, followed by infections of the gastrointestinal tract. The principal causative agents of respiratory infections are viruses, such as rhinovirus and adenovirus, which result in symptoms of the common cold, and influenza viruses that cause the more severe symptoms of flu. Episodes of upper respiratory tract infections are more common in the winter months, and adults typically experience 2 to 4 upper respiratory tract infection episodes per year. However, The nature of upper respiratory tract infection episodes associated with exercise is less clear, particularly in high-performance athletes. While upper respiratory tract infections or sore throats are the most common reason elite athletes visit their doctor, whether these symptoms are actually caused by infections or are a reflection of other inflammatory stimuli associated with exercise remains unclear. Infections are not usually verified by pathology examinations, and doctors' confirmation of an infective cause of the symptoms based on clinical signs and symptoms has been found to be less than 60% reliable. The focus on respiratory infections and exercise has been stimulated by the commonly held beliefs that the frequency of upper respiratory tract infections is increased in endurance athletes and that the incidence is associated with more intensive training. However, the evidence to support these concepts is inconclusive. The evidence does support the concepts that exercise-induced immune depression increases susceptibility to upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, and that these are associated with impaired athletic performance.
Just a thought there, if you're an endurance athlete and you're outside and you're doing a lot of exercise, they spoke here about upper airway inflammation.
Particularly in the cold.
Yeah, you're outside a lot and you're just having airway inflammation as a result of high levels of exercise.
Exactly. And I've seen a bit of literature just on the fact that, there's this very strong, very widely held belief that cold causes colds. The words are there, But the thing is, if you're breathing cold air, it's cold, dry air, and it irritates the throat on its own, and that's inflammatory. And it's not necessarily so that you're sick. We more experience our symptoms and our personal immune system reaction to something than we experience the effects of the virus per se or other pathogen.
And therefore, we have our recovery modalities for our muscles and our body post-exercise. But what are we doing for our airways post-exercise?
Good point. Moving on in the article, we see that prolonged bouts of strenuous exercise have a temporary negative impact on immune function. Post-exercise immune function depression is most pronounced when exercise is continuous, prolonged, meaning greater than 1.5 hours, of moderate to high intensity, meaning 55 to 75% of an athlete's aerobic capacity, and performed without food intake. And particularly, I would note here, I believe carbohydrate is the most important of that food intake for immune function. Both aspects of innate immunity and acquired immunity are depressed by prolonged exercise. We often use a particular marker, SIGA, salivary secretory immunoglobulin A, as a marker of immune function. This is one of your antibodies that we can readily, easily access through the saliva, and it's a quick, simple, maybe a 10-minute test for us to be able to understand it. So it's very commonly used and is a fairly good immune function marker. Looking at this marker, salivary secretory immunoglobulin A, we see that the response to acute exercise is variable, although very prolonged bouts of exercise are commonly reported to result in decreased SIGA secretion. The causes of immune depression after prolonged exercise are thought to be related to increases in circulating stress hormones, alterations in the pro or anti-inflammatory cytokine balance, and increased free radicals. Just a quick note on those circulating stress hormones. What they mean by that are adrenaline, epinephrine, cortisol, those sorts of hormones. Markers of immune function in athletes in the true resting state, at least 24 hours after the last exercise bout, are generally not very different from those of their sedentary counterparts, except when the athletes are engaged in periods of intensified training. Then, immune function might not fully recover from successive training sessions, and some functions can become chronically depressed. Both T and B lymphocyte functions appear to be sensitive to increases in training load in well-trained athletes undertaking a period of intensified training, with decreases in circulating numbers of type 1 T cells, inhibition of type 1 T cell cytokine production, reduced T cell proliferative responses, and falls in simulated B cell immunoglobulin synthesis and SIGA reported. To date, the only immune variable that has been consistently associated with increased infection incidence is salivary IgA. Low concentrations of SIGA in athletes or substantial transient falls in SIGA are associated with increased risk of upper respiratory tract infection. In contrast, increases in salivary IgA can occur after a period of regular moderate exercise training in previously sedentary individuals and could, at least in part, contribute to the apparent reduced susceptibility of upper respiratory tract infection associated with regular moderate exercise compared with a sedentary lifestyle. The available, albeit limited, evidence does not support the contention that athletes training and competing in cold conditions experience a greater reduction in immune function compared with thermoneutral controls. However, the inhalation of cold, dry air can reduce upper airway ciliary movement and decrease mucus flow, but it remains unknown if athletes who train and compete in cold conditions report more frequent, severe, or longer-lasting infection. Other environmental extremes, such as heat and altitude, or dehydration, do not seem to have a marked impact on immune responses to exercise. Infections can occur following exposure to new pathogens, but can also be caused by reactivation of a latent virus. For example, it has been shown that symptoms of an upper respiratory tract infection in swimmers were positively associated with previous Epstein-Barr viral infection and partially with viral shredding. Furthermore, there is increasing evidence that infection history has a strong influence on cellular immune response to exercise.
Thanks, Joe. That's a really thorough yet concise summary of exercise and upper respiratory tract infections, and really nice how they were just talking off the cuff around the role of cold air in different environments, and they actually brought that in saying that really there's no difference there.
That's what I love about this article. It's concise and comprehensive.
Yeah, and in the article, they just go straight on to conclusions and practical guidelines, and we'll just roll through these. And so just sit tight, listeners. We're just going to go through them all. And first one, we're going to start with just some practical guidelines. So firstly, we're going to go 5 at a time. Firstly, the individuals should be updated on all vaccines needed at home and for foreign travel. Minimize contact with infected people, young children, animals, and contagious objects. In particular, where I work, I'll still get athletes coming in going, I'm kind of okay. So I just tell athletes, if you're no good, stay away, not only for you, but for the athletes around you. Really important.
Yeah, people have this concept of not going to work when they're sick, for their own good, for them to feel better. No, it's so you don't get everyone else at work sick. That's why you don't go to work when you're sick. It's respectful.
Yeah, so keep a distance to people who are coughing, sneezing, or have a runny nose, and when appropriate, wear or ask them to wear a disposable mask. Wash hands regularly before meals and after direct contact with potentially contagious people, animals, blood, secretions, public places, and bathrooms. In particular, I've done a few cruises, and really interesting, they actually say to use paper towels to open and close the doors to the toilets.
Yeah, and I think we see that a lot in the gym, and that's possibly one thing that a lot of us could be better about gym behavior for, is a lot of people make contact with those things. They have specific handles, just like a door handle, and those surfaces need to be cleaned.
Definitely. And the last one in my little group here, use disposable paper towels and limit hand-to-mouth nose contact when suffering from respiratory or gastrointestinal infection symptoms. And also, in that, carry alcohol-based hand washing gel with you.
Do not share your drinking bottles, cups, towels, and other such materials that could transfer pathogens. While competing or training abroad, choose cold beverages from sealed bottles and avoid raw vegetables and undercooked meat. Wash and peel fruit before eating. And this was of particular interest for me when I was traveling around developing countries quite a bit, is because one thing is, if you buy a bottle of water, turn it upside down. If you're in a developing country, turn it upside down and just make sure you have a little look on the bottom of the bottle, because it does happen for people to save and make money, is they will actually drink or drain out the filtered clean water from the bottom of it through a pinprick, and they will refill those bottles with unclean water. And so you do need to be making sure that even though the top of the bottle may be sealed, also make sure that your bottle hasn't been tampered with.
And further on that, also from personal experience when I was in Egypt, I was quite careful with everything I did. However, I thought I was at, I think, KFC, desperate to eat. I got post-mix Coke with ice. Got quite sick afterwards. Then remembering that obviously they're just using their own water to make the ice and whatever with the post-mix. And you think you're in a westernized type franchise and you'd be okay. But little things like that always catch you.
Yeah, I think much fewer countries than people believe actually have potable water, have clean drinking water from the tap. And I think that's something that people in Western civilizations forget a lot of the time, is that's an amazing development that we've made. Continuing on, quickly isolate an individual with symptoms of infection from others. It's quarantining. Protect airways from being directly exposed to very cold and dry air during strenuous exercise by using a facial mask. Ensure adequate dietary energy, protein, and essential micronutrient intake.
Avoid crash dieting and rapid weight loss. In other words, eat properly. Ensure adequate carbohydrate intake before and during strenuous prolonged exercise to limit the extent and severity of exercise-induced immunodepression. The efficacy of most so-called dietary immunostimulants have not been confirmed. However, there is limited evidence that some flavonoids, such as quercetin and probiotics, can reduce upper respiratory tract infections incidence in highly physical active people. Daily ingestion of probiotics can also reduce the risk of gastrointestinal infections. Wear appropriate outdoor clothing in inclement weather and avoid getting cold and wet after exercise.
Get adequate sleep, at least 7 hours per night. Consider monitoring your sleep quantity and quality using a small, non-invasive movement sensor, such as the one in your phone. Now we have lots of apps readily available to monitor our sleep. Wear flip-flops or similar footwear when going to the showers, swimming pool, and locker rooms to avoid dermatological diseases. Keep other life stresses to a minimum. Easier said than done. Consulting a sports psychologist may be helpful to find ways to reduce stress and adopt suitable coping behaviors.
The next section here is around should infections occur. Exercisers may use some simple basic guidelines for exercise during infectious episodes before being referred to a doctor. So these are the simple things that you can do before having to run off and worrying about seeing a doctor, because most of the time you get ill, go see the doctor, and they just tell you, go home and rest. So save yourself a trip to the doctor, listen to these next 5 points, and that'll get you over the line initially.
On your first day of illness, avoid strenuous exercise or competitions when experiencing upper respiratory tract infection symptoms, such as a sore throat, coughing, runny or congested nose. Avoid all exercise when experiencing symptoms like muscle joint pain and headache, fever, and generalized feeling of malaise, diarrhea, or vomiting. So basically, if you feel like you're really sick, don't exercise at all on that first day. If you feel like you're a little bit sick, just avoid strenuous exercise. You can still do moderate or low intensity exercise.
On the second day, avoid exercise if fever, diarrhea, or vomiting is present, or if coughing is increased. If there's no fever or malaise is present, and there is no worsening of the above the collar symptoms, undertake light exercise, such as heart rate less than 120 beats per minute for around 30 to 45 minutes, indoors during winter by yourself. So here, being smart, if you know worse, keep it simple, don't do too much, even if you're feeling pretty good.
I'd like to emphasize that less than 120 beats per minute is very light exercise. That's a quick walk is what we're talking about there. On the third day, if fever and upper respiratory tract infection or gastrointestinal symptoms are still present, consult your doctor. If no fever or malaise is present and there is no worsening of initial symptoms, then you can undertake moderate exercise, a heart rate less than 150 beats per minute for 45 to 60 minutes, preferably indoors and by yourself. And just my personal recommendation, I would say keep it closer to the 40 to 45 minutes rather than full 60-minute side.
On the fourth day, if there's no symptom relief, do not try to exercise and visit your doctor. If this is the first day of improved conditions, wait one more day without fever and with improvement of upper respiratory tract infections or gastrointestinal symptoms before returning to exercise.
Finally, it is important to stop training and consult your doctor if a new episode with fever occurs or if initial symptoms become worse, coughing persists, or breathing problems occur during exercise. Observe closely your tolerance to increased exercise intensity and take an extra day off if recovery is incomplete.
And this is really important when you get close to a competition. People start stressing out that, well, I've got my major championships in 7 days' time. Well, it's no use stressing about it. You're sick and you need to be smart. In this case, less is more.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, listeners. Please remember, like, share, subscribe, comment, follow us on social media at snippetscience.com. Call us at home. Big thank you to our sponsor, eliteform.com, and a big thank you to BASES, the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, for putting this work of literature together for us. And finally, please find us on Patreon and help support the channel yourself.
See you next week.